Welcome, everyone. My name is Raja Kuri. I'm the CEO of Kuri Conversations, and I welcome you all to today's seminar titled How Has America Responded to Amnesty's Apartheid Report? We are going to be in conversation with Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. We will be properly introducing Lara and momentarily. Welcome, Lara. Wonderful for you to be with us today. Today's conversation comes to you in partnership between the Kuri Conversations and the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, and its chair, my friend and colleague Peter Larson, who will be co-hosting. But first, as we usually do, we will do the land acknowledgement. We as Canadians acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land and territories, known and unknown. We respect Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. As settlers and immigrants, we recognize that we have an active role in reconciliation. Well, welcome all. A special welcome to participants joining us from the United States, Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East. For those of you joining us for the first time, our conversations are geared towards dialogue and not debate. We're not looking for winners and losers, but we are looking for insight and understanding. Because of that, most of our conversations end without any casualties. So the format today is purely conversational. There's no presentation. Peter and I, we will be asking questions and having a conversation with Lara. Those of you who wants to contribute to the chat box can feel free to do that, but we will not be monitoring it. If you have questions to ask of Lara, you can do that in the Q&A box, please. And a final note is that this session is being recorded. And I will now briefly introduce Peter, who will be introducing Lara. Peter Larson is the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, a Canadian human rights organization focusing on the Middle East. His professional career included periods at the Public Policy Forum, the Conference Board of Canada, the French language daily Les Droits, and as a management consultant to labor unions and the federal government departments and agencies. He has traveled many times to the Middle East and has led trips to Israel-Palestine for Canadians interested in gaining a deeper understanding of that complex region. He was the founding chair of the Middle East Study Group of the Canadian International Council and a board member of the National Council on Canada-Arab Relations. His complete bio can be found on this page, on this events page on my website, kuriconversations.org. And over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Raja, and hello to everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Lara Friedman, who is the president and CEO of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I first became aware of Lara relatively recently, a year and a half ago, and was fascinated by the webinars that she organizes and the information, the rich wealth of information that's available on their website, which we'll provide a link to, of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Lara herself has a fascinating background. She was earlier in her career, she was actually a Foreign Service officer in the employ of the State Department. She served in Jerusalem, where she had wide responsibilities. And she indicated to me that over time, as both an American and as a Jew, she became increasingly uncomfortable what she saw in Israel-Palestine. She came back to North America, had a number of interesting assignments, including, I understand, in Wall Street, and then subsequently with American Friends of Americans for Peace Now, and then subsequently moved to the Foundation for Middle East Peace. She does a lot of terrific interviewing. I try to model myself on her interviewing style, but it's delicious opportunity for us to be able to turn the tables on her and interview her, because through her interviewing, she has gained a huge amount of information and understanding of what's happening broadly across the United States, and particularly on this issue of the Amnesty International report and what impact it had or didn't have. So, Lara, thank you very much. And Raja, you'll get the first crack at it.
Thank you, Peter. And, Lara, the Amnesty International's report on apartheid in Israel was, the last of many, as we know. In February, of course, of this year, Amnesty International published its report that concluded that Israel's treatment of Palestinians meets the legal definition of the crime of apartheid. Before that, there were a number of NGOs, human rights organizations, who had done the same thing, including Human Rights Watch, Israel's own B'Tselem and Yesh Din, as well as, even before any of them, Palestinian organizations such as Al-Haq and Mizan declared that the apartheid existed in the Israel-Palestine region. And lastly, 2 weeks ago, the UN Special Rapporteur, Michael Link, who is Canadian, articulated the same conclusion in an official report to the UN Security Council. So I guess my question to you are more accurately two questions is, what is yours and your organization's assessments of these reports? And are there any significant differences between them?
Thank you, Raja, and thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure being here, and thanks to everyone who's attending. I'm quite honored to be included, and I'm honored for the kind words that were said about our events. And I will say, to the extent that I am wise on these issues, it's because I do benefit from the brilliant people who I've had the opportunity to speak with, from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty, from working on human rights groups on the ground for a long time. In general, and I am not an international lawyer. I'm not an international human rights monitor. I am a consumer of all of the reports that you mentioned, and I've talked to the people involved in all of them. There's obviously the sort of through line through all of them is the adoption of the apartheid framework, of using the language of apartheid in international law. And let's just take a step back and remind ourselves that while apartheid is an Afrikaner word that is generally seen capital A, meaning that people think of apartheid South Africa, that under international law, the crime of apartheid is a crime that is not about South Africa. It is a crime that is characterized by certain practices, racial discrimination that is systematic as a form of government, privileging one ethnic group over another. There's all different pieces of it. And that is the way the term apartheid is being used in all of these reports, in all of these contexts. And in terms of an assessment, look, I mean, the debate over these reports is generally more a debate over whether people are comfortable with the use of the word apartheid. It isn't generally a debate about what is actually assessed in the reports. The facts are the facts. And you can get into a whole debate about whether the facts should matter. I mean, there are people who will say, well, fine, you have all these facts about home demolitions and land seizures, but what about terror? And okay, I get it. That there are people whose argument is going to be there's nothing the Palestinians do that isn't, because the Arabs attacked in 1948 or because Hamas or whatever. But from the perspective of human rights defenders and human rights monitoring, the facts are what they are. And for people either loving or disputing these reports, the facts aren't generally what has been in contention. And based on my own research, the work that we do, the monitoring we do, I mean, these are Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are the two premier human rights organizations in the world. B'Tselem is the premier human rights organization in Israel and one of widely recognized in the region, Yesh Din in its own right. And let's also remember that Palestinian human rights defenders and advocates have been saying the exact same thing for decades. And I think it's really important to just take a moment and recall, these are not ideas that are new. These are ideas that are suddenly being legitimized because it's non-Palestinian sources saying them. And that really should give people pause. to sort of wonder, if maybe one of the reasons we aren't in such a bad situation in the region today is that we didn't listen when Palestinians were saying the same things. It's sort of like, it's not true unless it's a non-Palestinian saying it. If that's what you believe, then there's a deeper problem in play here. I will say there are key differences between the reports. And I don't want to suggest that there's a conscious sort of evolution, sort of along a spectrum towards where we ended with the Amnesty report and where we go next. But if you start, for instance, with the Yesh Din report, which was Michael Sfard, premier human rights defender in Israel, it really concerned itself with the situation across the Green Line. Right? It's about the occupied territories and saying there's apartheid in the occupied territories. And that's as far as it went. B'Tselem looked at that and went a step further and said, you can't, you have to look at both sides of the Green Line, and it assessed the situation and the policies on both sides of the Green Line and determined that there are apartheid practices on both sides of the Green Line. Human Rights Watch took it a step further and basically talked about a system of apartheid. It's actually quite similar to B'Tselem in the conclusion, but it was a much more heavily researched, long report with a lot more law. Amnesty took it a step further. Amnesty basically talked about it wasn't just describing the situation today. Amnesty goes back to the founding of the state of Israel to trace what were basically apartheid policies that were put in place and that sort of built the system where we are today. And if you read the report carefully, it's not determinative. It's not, I think, suggesting that there was no way that Israel could have been anything but an apartheid state, but it is identifying the sort of policy trends, the underlying prejudices that were built into the system from very early on. And it also goes further in terms of, it describes apartheid as existing inside the Green Line in 48 Israel, across the Green Line in the occupied territories. And also it talks about Palestinian refugees suffering from a form of apartheid by being unable to claim their legitimate rights as refugees to their property, to either return home or to compensation, which are basic rights of refugees. So that's, I think, sort of where that spectrum exists.
Lara, I find that interesting, that progression as one over the other, I think makes sense. The Amnesty International report also not only went back to 1948, but it also mentioned the right of return of the refugees, which I think was also a huge step. And I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense is that that's what made the Amnesty report so toxic to most liberal Zionists, many of whom could be in agreement with, they might not be comfortable with the phrasing of using apartheid. They certainly agree that what's going on inside the occupied territories isn't nice, whatever words they would use. But when it comes to the right of return, 1948, and even saying there is a regime of apartheid within Israel, that's what they find a lot of, makes them very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Amnesty report, I think, was difficult for a lot of people to swallow who maybe weren't as upset before. I mean, it's Amnesty International, first of all. And Human Rights Watch is a big deal. Amnesty International is an even bigger deal. And for progressives who maybe look to Amnesty as the gold standard on everything related to human rights, this was unendurable. I mean, you can't sit back and, I mean, there was no way to, it's sort of like, that doesn't compute kind of feeling. I think that's the first part of it. But I think the second part is what you're saying. Amnesty, in a very clear way, situates its analysis not simply in the current day and describing reality as it is, but all the way back to 48 and describing how we got where we are today. And I think that the concern is, and you hear this from people who, when you listen to some of the defenses, when people get angry hearing the Amnesty report or any of the reports that talk about apartheid, one of the defenses you hear is, this is clearly anti-Semitic because it's denying Israel the right to self-determination, because if we actually fix all the things you say are wrong, Zionism can't be what it is. And that's kind of saying the quiet part out loud, right? It's essentially saying, we want Israel to be a state which gives supremacy to Jewish citizens at the cost of what we believe, what is democracy and equality and anti-racism and anti-discrimination. We want that, but we still want to be called a democratic state. But if we have to pick, we'll pick the supremacist state. And if you demand that all of these rights be respected, you're saying it's the end of Israel. I mean, it is sort of the quiet part out loud. And that kind of, there's a cognitive dissonance, I think, for a lot of progressives who have long believed that whether it's the two-state solution or some other kind of, if you wrap yourself in this cloak of I support negotiations, I support two states, that somehow that inoculates you from being responsible for essentially being supportive of a regime that isn't democratic in any real way, except for Jewish citizens of Israel, which, let's be clear, is not democratic. Saying Israel is democratic for its Jewish citizens is not saying it's a democracy in any serious way.
Mm.
You mentioned Amnesty being sort of the gold standard, and if I'm not mistaken, even the State Department normally considers Amnesty to be the gold standard. And yet, the American ambassador to Israel, Tom Nides, he called the report absurd. And he said, that's not language we have used and we will never use it. The US Democratic Senator, Bob Menendez, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, condemned AI's charges of apartheid, saying that, and I quote, Amnesty International has joined a growing chorus of vicious voices intent on denying Israel's right to exist through slander, misinformation, and ignoring that both Israelis and Palestinians are responsible for their own fates, end quote. Vicious, I mean, calling all of a sudden Amnesty International is vicious and anti-Semitic. I mean, how is, he talked about, dissidents, and how can someone at that position say these things about the last and the biggest of the human rights organizations who have said it over and over and over again? What's going on here?
I mean, I have to think that Amnesty can't have been entirely surprised that this was the reaction. I think they must have hoped that they'd get a better reception, or at least a more constructive reception. I mean, look, I don't think anyone expected the United States government to adopt the language of apartheid. I think it might not have been unreasonable, although maybe it would have been fatally optimistic, to think that the administration would have at least engaged on the substance of the report. It's one thing to say, we don't agree with this framing, but we share the deep concerns of Amnesty about these policies, right? There are ways the State Department could have engaged that would have been constructive. The response from the administration and the response from Congress was, I mean, it was somewhat, I think, it was foreshadowed by what we saw from Israel in the days before the actual report came out, when people had seen an advance copy. And the basic message that came out was, don't even bother reading this. Don't read it. We're telling you what it is. It's anti-Semitic, it's anti-Israel. There's no need to even talk about the facts, because now that we've labeled it anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, engaging in the facts at all is just rewarding and fueling anti-Semitism and anti-Israel stuff. So there you have an excuse to not even engage the facts at all. Or even better yet, you can frame it as, this report is actually harming the cause of peace. To actually engage the facts would be to harm the cause of peace, which is, kind of surreal when you think about what's in this 280-page report. I will say that it is deeply dispiriting, as someone who's formerly with the U.S. government, to see this kind of unnuanced response. To the extent that there was perhaps an opportunity to engage constructively, I think what you saw instead was a U.S. response that was gauged to respond to what was going to be most palatable politically, or cost them the least in political capital. This administration in the US does not want to spend political capital on the Palestinians. It just doesn't. And we've seen that over and over since they came into office. And in Congress, Israel-Palestine has been turned into one of the most, here we'll use the words vicious, a vicious weapon to be used against progressives. We see this with the anti-Semitism battles. We see it with what you're allowed to say. To stand up for even the substance of what's being reported by Amnesty, by Human Rights Watch, by B'Tselem, is now to really open the door for being not for people engaging you on the substance, but for being accused of being an anti-Semite or anti-Israel. And the Biden administration doesn't want to have to play that game. That's just not in their, that does not, I shouldn't say what, I don't know what they want. I can observe as an analyst, it appears that they don't want to do that. And certainly in Congress, there are very few who do.
Lara, I'd like to ask you a little bit about liberal Jewish responses to this in the States. In Canada, the liberal Zionist organizations like the Canadian Friends of Peace Now have basically avoided it. As expected, the more central and right-wing Jewish organizations have just come up with the same kind of denunciation that you're talking about, but the left, more liberal ones have been quiet about it. You can define liberal Zionist or liberal Jewish opinion as broadly or as narrowly as you want, but I'm thinking of organizations like J Street, J Street, maybe if not now, I don't know, a variety of organizations that are liberal and not necessarily explicitly anti-Zionist. How have they reacted to this report?
So it's a good question. I think that generally speaking, J Street, Americans for Peace Now, what you saw were statements that were geared to focus people on the substance. I think for a lot of us, and I heard this from Palestinian friends, you can debate the word apartheid all you want. The bottom line is, are you standing with Palestinian rights and Palestinian human rights and Palestinian civil rights? The apartheid paradigm is an extremely valuable shift, having it become more normalized, the shift in the Overton window to thinking about things in a way that corresponds more to the reality on the ground today. Let
me just interrupt. Remind us what the Overton window is, so we're all on the same page on that.
It's a term that I've only started using recently. It's the idea that there is within this window is what is considered within the mainstream of how people are thinking about something or talking about something. I have no idea where the term comes from. I could make up a really fun meaning. Someone can Google it while we're talking. But shifting the Overton window left or right, in the US, it's been shifted significantly to the right in terms of some really scary things that are in the political agenda now that, 20 years ago would have been seen as somewhat insane. But on things like Israel-Palestine, you can argue there has been at the grassroots, certainly a shift to the left where talking about apartheid, talking about Palestinian rights, talking about a post-two-state scenario or a non-two-state scenario has become not seen as so radical or marginal. So you have that. I think if you look at the statements specifically that came out of APN and J Street, you see language which is explicitly about let's look at the facts, let's engage the facts, because the facts are very, very worrying and very problematic. And if we don't engage the facts, things will get worse. As far as some of the more activist groups, I think you saw more of a rallying around a readiness to at least entertain, if not directly adopt, the apartheid framing. I haven't gone through and cataloged all of them, but there has certainly been a shift, particularly at the progressive grassroots and the younger generation. There has been a shift towards making space for, if not outright embracing this framework. I will say that the move away from the two-state solution is a real challenge for progressive Zionists, for liberal Zionists. You see this, that the sort of win, the fact that, decades ago, getting the world to accept a two-state solution seemed like such an incredible breakthrough and a win for peace. And the idea now of not only like giving that up, but opening the door for what is going to be a much more complicated future, because if it's not going to be two states, then it's going to be some version of something else. And whether you talk about one state or a confederation or 17 states, all of those seem much more complicated. And the path to it seems a lot less clear. And one of the things that people liked about the two-state solution and having it on the table is it absolved them of having to think about all the things that are in the Amnesty report, right? Because the idea was, don't focus on all this minutia. Focus your energies on a peace process that will get to a solution, and that solution will wrap all of this up neatly with a bow. And if you waste time and energy on this minutia, we'll never get there, and you're the problem. And the shift in the paradigm today is one that basically says we're not going to let this idea, this perpetually receding horizon for peace, become an excuse to not talk about the facts on the ground now and not fight for rights now. It's a real paradigm shift, and for people who feel like they need to know the outcome in order to fight and move forward or invest in the present, which is you shouldn't that framing has always been a problem, right? You do what's right because it's right, not because someone tells you if you do what's right, you'll get a payoff, right? But on Israel Palestine, progressives have been trained to believe that you do what's right because at the end is this. Okay, well, I'm telling you now that end is not available quite likely, and you're not doing what's right. You need to do what's right, irrespective of where it takes you. And that is really a huge mental shift. And I think these reports from the human rights groups help push people there.
Thank you. Very helpful. Raja?
Yeah, I'm reminded of the time of Thatcher and Reagan and the South African apartheid, when both of these leaders, rejected the notion completely and refused to participate in any kind of sanctions. And at the time, both houses of Congress passed laws that condemned apartheid in South Africa. The President Reagan at the time vetoed the legislation, and then both houses, overcame that veto with a very large majority. Now, in today's world, and as you suggested, in Congress, none of that is even within the possible future. So we cannot expect to see that kind of upward push from below. So where do we go from here? What do we human rights defenders do next? I mean, if the West's establishment is ignoring this, is rejecting it. Only 2 days ago, our foreign affairs minister here, Melanie Joly, she said the government of Canada, rejects the notion, rejects the findings of Amnesty International, and they, as someone posted on the Q&A, CIJA, our sort of equivalent of AIPAC in the States, of course, congratulated and thanked the minister for not believing in the lies. So I guess, what do we do next?
No, I don't have a good answer. I'm not a grassroots organizer activist. I will say that the situation is never static, and anybody watching the news from Israel today, the horrific shooting in Tel Aviv, the situation on the ground is not static, and it is hard to see right now where the space is politically for things to shift to a different approach, politically, from the US, from Canada, from others. But if you come at this as someone who is deeply concerned, first and foremost, with the safety and security of Israelis, the status quo is not is incompatible with the safety and security of Israelis. You cannot keep millions of people under occupation. You cannot have a system inside the Green Line that is, by definition, look at the nation state law, a supremacist system. I mean, when the Knesset repasses legislation that prevents Palestinian citizens of Israel from bringing Palestinian spouses in, and in the past, this was always justified in terms of security, but this time the Minister of Interior tweets out, score 1 for Jewish democratic state, 0 for a nation of all its people. I mean, it's like we're not even pretending. This is not. I'm in no way justifying terror. This is not justifying violence. It is observing that the status quo is not stable and it's not secure for Israelis, and it is devastating for Palestinians. It is devastating for Palestinians under normal circumstances. Under current circumstances, when Israelis are once again experiencing daily violence as opposed to the structural violence that Palestinians face, it becomes worse for Palestinians, because we're in a time of mass collective punishment and settler violence and retribution. For anyone who remembers last summer, I know it's a long time ago, remembering how bad things can get when it escalates. I'm sorry, there's drilling going on in my house. That's what you're hearing. I'm having a closet installed. But this can get very, very bad very quickly. And the solution isn't simply more security, better security, higher fences, deeper tunnels, trenches. The solution is resolving the conflict and having rights for everyone who lives between the river and the sea. That's got to be a solution. I don't know when we get there. I don't know when policy shifts to make that possible, but I mean, that's the only solution down the road. I'm so sorry about the drilling.
It's okay.
I was going to make a comment about you coming out of the closet, but I'll just leave it. So, Lara, just back on the U.S. again, please. A reaction in the U.S., in America, to this Amnesty report. I understand, of course, that you're not Palestinian, but I'd like your view as an analyst on what have been the reactions of various Palestinian organizations that you're aware of in the U.S. Yeah.
So I first of all, I'd encourage you to have a Palestinian speaker. So they have Palestinians speak for themselves. The lack of Palestinian voices is, again, one of the reasons why we are where we are today. Speaking to my colleagues and friends in Palestinian organizations and academia and think tanks, and this is, at this point, it's not just the United States, right? The borders are irrelevant. Everyone's communicating via Zoom and social media, and voices are out there. Look, I think there is unquestionably a sense of vindication and validation as these reports come out and say what Palestinians have been saying for years, right? Finally, you get this validation and vindication. That's number one. Number two, I think there's a sense of exhaustion and outrage. We have been telling you all of these years this is happening. You don't believe it until white people and Jewish people say it too. Are you kidding me? Which is totally understandable. I was talking to a colleague on the ground. That there was a movie that came out, an Israeli movie not long ago, which is a documentary documenting a massacre that took place during 48. And it's sort of shattering myths inside Israel, because this had come up previously. Someone had written a PhD on it and then had to take their PhD thesis back because it upset so many people, and he was sued and he said, no, it's not true. It never happened. Well, now you've got a documentary where they're interviewing soldiers who committed the massacre, talking about having committed the massacre. So suddenly you've got, front page news in Israeli papers that there was a massacre, and Palestinians are saying, what are you we've been telling you there was a massacre. We've been documenting this for years. How does it not count unless someone else documents it? So I think that's another piece of it. The last piece of it, which in some ways I think is the most sort of challenging, I think the previous ones are all interesting reactions, so they make a lot of sense, is that there's a Palestinian amongst the most intelligent, thoughtful people I know on the Palestinian scene. There is a lot of questioning about where the Amnesty report takes this in terms of not going far enough, or in terms of failing to actually change the paradigm completely. Which is to say that the Amnesty report stays within the paradigm of state-to-state relations, a legitimate sovereign state of Israel whose borders are kind of problematic, with policies that are problematic on both sides of those borders, dating back from 48 forward. The Palestinian intellectual narrative, and I think it's one that is certainly gaining traction in the Palestinian grassroots in a way that it has not previously, is a narrative which says this has to be understood in terms of settler colonialism, right? This isn't simply a matter of the problems with how a legitimate sovereign state is operating, and this framing, talk about framing that is challenging to liberal Zionists. I mean, you opened this, Raja, you opened today's webinar talking about settlers and indigeneity and all that, and that's amazing. That I don't think that would ever happen. That would rarely happen in an event in the United States. The idea that Israelis should look at themselves and, first of all, the argument would be, well, we are indigenous. This is the homeland of the Jewish people. Look at the Bible. We have a deed to the land that goes back to the Bible, which is why I, Lara Friedman, can exercise my right of return tomorrow to my homeland of Hebron. So you have that piece of it. And you have this fundamental sort of shift in whether or not, again, this goes back to whether or not there is any legitimate, under international law, under a modern liberal sense of morality, any legitimate way to sort of embrace Zionism without being a hypocrite. That's what that framing really challenges people to do. it challenges me. And it's, you know, I'm at a point in my own sort of intellectual development where my feeling is if something challenges me, I need to lean into it harder and learn more, because it's something I clearly need to be listening to. I've been, as many progressive Americans who care about, you know, Palestinians and Israelis and Jewish and Palestinian alike, I have been in a very comfortable place for a long time, feeling like I am doing the right thing and supporting things that are good and trying to make peace in a place that's very comfortable. Palestinians are really pushing the world to recognize that that comfort is not conducive to actual fairness, justice, freedom for Palestinians. And I would argue that lacking those things, you also don't have peace, security, freedom for Israelis.
I want to thank Catherine for posting a definition of the Overton window. It says that this window is the range of policies politically acceptable to the mainstream population at a given time. It is also known as the window of discourse. So we have a question here about BDS, and now that the West has imposed its own BDS on Russia, is that likely to make a BDS in the Palestinian sort of movement part possibly more acceptable to more people?
I want to give a two-part answer. The first part is I want to challenge the use of BDS to describe what the West is doing to Russia. And here I would point folks to an incredibly powerful and important article by Yusuf Munayyer, published a couple of weeks ago on this topic, which really, I think, does an extremely good job. Yusuf always does an extremely good job explaining what is BDS and the BDS movement in terms of very carefully targeting forces that are responsible for the violations of Palestinian rights, as opposed to a racially based, ethnically based, religiously based boycott, all of which are indefensible morally. I mean, that's sort of the point. If you talk to Yusuf, or we had Omar Barghouti on a webinar recently, which will be, hopefully that webinar will be released tomorrow or Monday. You know, the idea of the way the West has responded to Russia, when you see people boycotting Russian cats and Russian vodka, I mean, that is not a targeted boycott that's intended to change policy. That's just straight up ethnic profiling, racism, discrimination. It's a really it's sort of shocking, the ease with which the entire, so much of the West sort of shifted into a straight up hatred of everything Russian, to the extent that even Russian dissidents, there's you have concerts canceled and Russian scholars, and it's really problematic. That's not what BDS is, and I think you have to first draw that line. The second part of the answer is, given that we now have members of Congress literally calling for, in this order, boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Russia, if nothing else, it certainly is a moment of clarity. That all of these things that people said you can never do to Israel because it's wrong to ever do it. You shouldn't bring politics into sports, except now we can when it's Russia. You shouldn't bring politics into academia, except you can when it's Russia. This is it certainly shines a very, very bright spotlight into the exceptionalism which is afforded to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's an exceptionalism that says Israel cannot be protested in all of these ways, and an exceptionalism that says anything the Palestinians do to protest is unacceptable. It certainly challenges that. I don't know what that will mean, going forward, whether that will shift anything, but it certainly has opened the space to discuss it in a way that we didn't have before. By the way, I should add, going back to Amnesty for a second, watching the U.S. Congress, and for folks who are watching the U.S. on like BDS, we have, laws in 30 some states targeting BDS, using state contracts and state investment in state pension funds as the hook to punish companies that boycott either Israel or settlements, by the way, it's both of them. Yesterday in Congress, a new piece of legislation, the Senate was introduced by a senator from Florida, which seeks to punish Amnesty International. And just to get a sense of just how blunt an instrument people are willing to go to in order to punish critics of Israel, the legislation targeting Amnesty, it's framed as, we don't want any US tax dollars supporting this horrible anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, work. Except Amnesty International doesn't receive any US tax dollars. So the legislation, when you actually read it, targets Amnesty's employees to deprive them of employee benefits, the rights, the benefits that employees of any company, any organization in the United States have as employees, as American citizens, if their employee protections, it targets those. I mean, it's just stunning. And when you think about the implications of legislation like this, the precedent that it would show if members of Congress wanted to target Planned Parenthood, okay, so we'll just target all their employees and make it impossible financially to work for them. This is the I'm sorry, it's a long way of saying this, but fundamentally, and I've been saying for years, for Americans, maybe you don't give a crap about Israel, Palestine, and boycotts or whatever of Palestine. Maybe that you don't care about that at all. Maybe you support it. But I'm telling you, Israel, Palestine cares about you, and this issue is coming for your free speech. And maybe you don't mind, but we now have many states. I have a table tracking this on our website where the anti-BDS legislation at the states is now being repurposed to target companies that boycott the fossil fuel industry or that quote unquote discriminate against the guns and ammunition industry. We have 2 states that have introduced legislation which basically would punish, by depriving them of the right to have contracts or investment, companies that boycott or discriminate against, and then it has a list of all the industries that the state has decided you're not allowed to boycott, including like timber, deforestation, or industrial level agriculture, which is an environmental issue, and oil and gas and guns and ammunition. And I mean, these are the tools that are being perfected in order to make sure that Israel is exceptionalized forever in the protest space, and which can then be repurposed to be used against anything. So the stakes, I feel like maybe Americans are starting to understand the stakes are a little bit higher than just the rights of Palestinians. It's a shame that that's what may be required for them to care.
Peter?
Yeah, Lara, I'd like to pick up a question from the audience that's not exactly on topic, but it's the kind of question that we hear from time to time, and I'd like to see very much how you would answer it. It's from Murray Rubin. And he writes in saying, Lara, in all honesty, if the Arabs had won the war in 1948, would there be a Jewish state and a Palestinian state? Really what he's, I guess, getting at is, don't we need to do what we're doing in order to live? Or I think that's the intent of the question. How do you must run into that a lot. How do you respond to that?
I mean, the first thing I say is I don't do retrospective crystal ball gazing. I don't know what would have happened if 48 had turned out differently. I don't. And for people who say absolutely, if this, those sort of hypotheticals, I think are simply that I can understand why people find them appealing. I don't. They neither prove nor disprove anything, and I don't engage in them. If this really boils down to, and I sort of touched on this before, the idea that we have to do whatever we have to do in order to have our state, I think, again, that's sort of saying the quiet part out loud, because that's exactly what Palestinians have been saying Israel has been doing. And, for my entire lifetime, for all of us who were born after 67, we've grown up in a world where Israel insists, no, we're not doing any of those things. We're not a supremacist state. We don't discriminate against Palestinians. We're not taking land. We're not demolishing houses. It's only about security. We just want to live in peace, blah, blah, blah. Except that isn't true. I mean, and it never was true, but especially it isn't true now when you've got an Israeli government that certainly since the beginning of the second Netanyahu era, is really aiming at greater Israel, right? This is the agenda. You build settlements, you limit Palestinian access to land, you do it openly, you do it quietly, you do it proudly, you do it below. I mean, this is the policy. And if the argument is, listen, we have to do everything we're doing, my first answer is bullshit. I'm sorry. Years ago, I testified at the UN Security Council on settlements when I was still at Peace Now. And it was really, it was testimony where we knew it was going to be examined. Every single word had been fact checked, that every word out of my mouth had been fact checked in advance. And at the end of it, the Israeli ambassador to the UN accused me and my colleagues, maybe one of my colleagues, but it sort of basically said the whole thing was an act of diplomatic terrorism, but didn't challenge any of the facts, because there's nothing that could be challenged in what I said. I was using Israeli statistics for my settlement reporting. And shortly after that, I went and spoke. I was invited to speak at a synagogue in Los Angeles, and ostensibly about the same thing I talked about at the UN. And as soon as I got up there and sat down, the rabbi, pretty much his entire approach to me was, well, yeah, you went to the UN and talked about settlements, but you didn't say anything about terror. I said, I don't understand. I was invited to the UN to talk about Israeli settlement policy. And you're saying that you can't talk about settlements unless I talk about, Hamas suicide bombings. The suggestion seemed to be that if Hamas engages in suicide bombings, Israel has no other choice except to take more land and build more settlements. And that's where you sort of get to the bullshit. I mean, you can certainly use that politically as a pretext if that's what you want to do anyway, but bad behavior from some Palestinian parties doesn't compel Israel to do bad things to Palestinians. Israel's made that choice. The logic is really, I think about my grandfather, who was a huge Zionist. The creation of Israel for him was the greatest miracle of his life. And, if you had told him that, 50 years down the road, the argument would be that in order to exist, Israel has a right to do anything it wants with total impunity, and anyone asking for any oversight or consequence for anything Israel does should be called an anti-Semite. I think he would have been appalled. That wasn't the Israel that he thought he was supporting and fighting for politically at the time. So I don't know. I don't know what happened in 48. I'm sure some wonderful science fiction writers can write all sorts of alternative stories of what happens if Israel had been created in Alaska or something. It isn't interesting. Israel does exist. It was created. It's not going to be uncreated, that you can't go back in time. The question is, what do we as moral human beings who care about people, both Jewish, Muslim and Christian, Palestinian and Israeli, we care about people. What should we be supporting today, given what the reality on the ground is today and where it's going?
Lara, that this language bullshit, we don't use that here in Canada.
I'm sorry. Yes, I know. Canadians don't curse. I know.
No, we're very polite. You know that. We have Virginia asking here that what is it? What do you think of this root? What is the root of the exceptionalism? How did that?
Israeli receptionism?
It doesn't say. The question doesn't ask, but I leave it.
Look, think it's linked. Israeli and Palestinian exceptionalism are linked. They're two sides of the same coin, right? So Israel is exceptional in that it cannot be held to account, and it has impunity, and everything is sui generis. You can't compare it to anything. And Palestinians are exceptional in that all of their rights have to be viewed through the lens of Israel's exceptionalism. And so they're two sides of the same coin. The roots, I hesitate to try to sum this up because I think there's many different pieces of it. I think people have written books about it. I think the roots of that include the struggle over indigeneity, right? So the idea that you actually have two people that have legitimate historical, cultural, religious claims to this land, that makes it it makes it a fairly unique conflict that way. I think I remember when, I want to be careful saying this because I remember when Barack Obama referenced the Holocaust in his support for Israel's creation, and he was accused of being an anti-Semite because he referenced the Holocaust, which is so weird because I was raised as a Jewish American to believe that part of the great miracle of Israel's creation was that it came out of the ashes of the Holocaust and would save Jews. So there was always that connection between the Shoah and Israel's creation. But anyway, you have a sense, I think, of international responsibility, guilt, trying to do something to remedy the horror of the Holocaust and the failure of the international community, including the US, to do anything about it. You've got the religious investment that comes from not just a Jewish diaspora, which I think a lot of may not have been super may not have been universally engaged in the Israeli enterprise in 48, but certainly post 67 and 73 became deeply engaged, deeply supportive, and the identity of Jewish Americans, I don't want to speak about Jewish Canadians, but certainly Jewish Americans, became deeply interwoven with, if not largely dominated by Zionism. And let's, in the United States for sure, again, I'm not going to speak about Canada, I think you have to also pay attention to the Zionist evangelical Christian piece of it, which really began in the US to gain strength in the Reagan era and just has surged forward. And if you see events now in the in Israel, and you have members of Knesset talking about Israel's greatest, most reliable allies in the world, and they're not talking about the Jewish diaspora, they're talking about the evangelical Christian diaspora, which sees the ingathering of the Jewish people in the Holy Land as necessary for the second coming of Christ, at which point most of us will die in a pool of fire. So yeah, many reasons. And then look, you also have, and some of this is, I think, real, and I think some of this is the product of years of really good public relations. You have a sense of shared values, shared identity. Israel is like the West in so many ways. It's very easy. You only have to look at, the refugee crisis in the Ukraine versus the refugee crisis from any country in the Middle East or Africa to see that people tend to be, and I think this is human nature, tend to sympathize more with people who they feel are like them. It's one of the foibles of human nature, and it's pretty awful. But I think that sense of, the Israelis are like us and the rest of the Middle East isn't, as an American value, even if it's not true. And things like the war on terror, which Israel and supporters of Israel really worked hard to build in the minds of Americans and the West in general, is exactly analogous to the challenges that Israel faces, as if the Palestinians are ISIS and Al Qaeda, and Israel is the United States and the Twin Towers. It's a long answer, sorry.
I see we're getting near the end here. I just wanted to bring to your attention, Lara, and perhaps other people who are watching today. As you know, the use of the word apartheid, notwithstanding all the description by Amnesty International that apartheid doesn't just apply to South Africa, they have different forms, not the same thing. It still is sort of the point of reference. And what sticks in a lot of people's craw right away is to say, well, Palestinians can vote, or all kinds of examples, counterfactuals to South Africa. OFEP is going to be organizing a webinar on the 27th of April, coming at this whole question from the other end, namely examining Israel's claim to be a liberal democracy with flaws, like Canada might be a liberal democracy with flaws. And we will spend some time examining the similarities and differences, well, the situation of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And the person who will be helping us understand that is a man named Jonathan Cook, who is married to a Palestinian. He actually is now an Israeli citizen, although he was born British, married to a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and has two kids who are Palestinian citizens of Israel as well. So that will be an interesting discussion, trying to pry open this notion: is Israel legitimately claiming to be a liberal democracy, or are there some very significant holes in that? So rather than trying to prove apartheid, we're coming at it from the other end. Say, okay, what are the differences? That's on. I will provide in the follow-up email. I'll provide a link to that for anybody who's interested.
I would also like to announce two upcoming webinars with Curie Conversations. On May 11, I will be having a one-on-one interview with Julia Basha. She is the director of the film Boycott. It's a documentary film that is making the festival circuits as we speak. It will be premiering in Canada at Hot Docs Festival here in Toronto on May 1st. So in partnership with Hot Docs, we will provide access to the movie at a discounted rate. And then an interview with Julia on May the 11th at 5 p.m. to talk about her work. And this film obviously goes to what you were saying, Lara, earlier about the freedom of speech. It is about the laws that were put in place in the United States, in many states, banning the boycott of Israel and making it a requirement for employment, any contracts with the state, and so on. The other upcoming event is on May 25th, and it's with Khalid Al-Gindi, and we will be talking about the subject of Palestinian leadership. What next for Palestinian leadership? As you know, there isn't much of leadership right now, fortunately, and the expectation is that Mahmoud Abbas is going to pass on at some point. So what happens next? What happens between now and then? What are the possibilities, and is there hope to look for? So with this, Peter, do you have anything else to add?
I just wanted to thank Lara for devoting time and sharing her insights and passion for this topic. Is wonderful. We will be putting a link to the Foundation for Middle East Peace in the follow-up email. I encourage everybody to take a look at it. And of course, Raja, thank you for collaborating again with me on this. I think it's been a terrific session. So thank you to both of you.
Well, thank you, Lara, very much. This was very enlightening, even to people like me who follow the subject closely. You have said things that make me think about certain things in a different way. And thank you, Peter, for partnering with us today. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you found this as informative and satisfying as we have. Have a good evening, and we will see you soon in another webinar.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for having me.